Hello everyone. Welcome to our very first installment of the QBAC speaker series. I am the president of the Queen's Black Alumni Chapter. My name is Yinka Adibusi. I am Art Sci 13. I studied physics and math at Queen's. And on behalf of our advisory members, our team, our executive team, would like to welcome you all to this amazing event with Dr. Katherine McKittrick, where she'll be giving a talk on the Black Studies program at Queen's. So here at the Black Alumni Chapter, just to provide a few overview about us, we are the Black Alumni Chapter. We are an affinity group under the Queen's University Alumni Association, and our mission is to connect Black alumni, students, faculty, and staff members to each other in support of each other's aspiration, but also we want to build a community that inspires each other, supports each other in whatever it is that they do. And one of our key aspects of our pillar is supporting the programming and the initiatives specifically in the Black community at Queen's. And this is why we made the decision to have or to welcome Dr. Katherine here to talk about the amazing program, the newly founded Black Study program at Queen's. So there are a few folks on the call that I've had the opportunity to talk to, that have had the opportunity to take one of the courses in the program prior to them graduating at Queen's. And it's been such an amazing program. And it just requires, even though we've all heard about it, from the grapevine, it would be nice for us to finally have Dr. Katherine here to talk a little bit about the program, specifically how alumni can get involved in the program to make sure that this amazing initiative, this amazing stance continue to grow and continue to build. So from here on, I'll pass it on to our host, Dantal, to pretty much provide us with a welcome address. And also we have Samara Legiam, who is the president of the Queen's Student Alumni Association, who will also be providing a welcome address on behalf of the students, but also the land acknowledgement. So take it away, Dantal.
Absolutely. Samara, as you are doing the land acknowledgement, may I ask you to speak before I do, and then I'll get straight to it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for including me in this event. I'm so excited to hear more about this program from the perspective of the first professor to teach a Black Studies course at Queen's. And as a student that's in courses currently, I think that the introduction of this program has probably been one of the most impactful things that have happened at my time at Queen's. So thanks so much to the QBAC team for putting this event together, and for Dr. McKittrick for being here to speak with us today. So getting into the land acknowledgement, I'd like to start off this event by acknowledging that I'm located on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. As someone born in what is now known as Canada, I want to recognize my positionality and the privileges that I have as a settler. And as the children of refugees from Eritrea, I want to acknowledge the global scale of colonization and the way that it's impacted my family, even on the other side of the world. Across Canada and globally, the process of colonization is ongoing, and we all have the responsibility to help remedy the institutional and cultural ramifications today. In our lives, we must commit to fighting anti-Indigenous oppression and biases in our country, institutions, communities, and most importantly, when we find it within ourselves. In our actions and in our words, we must acknowledge and respect this land's Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee roots and the history of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. And I encourage everyone to reflect on your own positionality and privilege so that we can move past words towards tangible action and reconciliation. Thank you. I'll pass it back off to Dantel.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Samara. So good evening, everybody. My name is Dantel Sampson, and I am the current QBAC VP of Events, and I will be your host and facilitator for this evening's event. We have the very special privilege of sharing a space with our very special guest, Dr. Katherine McKittrick, and I will do the honor of introducing her. So Dr. Katherine McKittrick is a professor of gender studies and the Canada Research Chair in Black Studies at Queen's. She authored Demonic Grounds, Black Women and the Cartographies of Struggle, and edited and contributed to Sylvia Wynter on Being Human as Praxis. And her most recent monograph, Dear Science and Other Stories, is an exploration of Black methodologies. It's an honor and pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Katherine. I've gotten acquainted with some of your work. I'm very excited to hear from you and receive your insights into the minor in Black Studies that is at Queen's.
Thank you so much. You can all hear me. Good. Thank you, Samara, Dantel. Thank you, Yinka, for inviting me. This is a little talk. I shouldn't say it's little. I'd say it's about 20, 25 minutes long. Unless I go off script, it'll be a little bit longer. But it's a talk that I've given a few different times, that it's reflections on what it means to build Black studies, how we built Black studies at Queen's, and then what the future of Black studies might be. So I'm going to begin with an overview, like a basic overview of Black studies, that maybe Samara will remember threads of this from when she took the introduction to Black studies couple of years ago, last year. And then I'll sort of get into the more interesting things, at least to me. So because the reason I'm going to begin with a background of Black studies generally is because what we intentionally did was pull from the field of Black studies and the organizing that underpins Black studies to establish the minor in Black studies at Queen's. What animated our decision to build the minor was not from the outset the desire to fulfill diversity expectations at the level of representation, but rather to build on existing work in Black studies inside and outside post-secondary institutions, and develop an intellectual project that spoke to questions of collaboration, liberation, and pedagogy. What you see at work are two interlocking processes. First is that the university, we assume that the university is porous. That is, the work of Black studies is not just beholden to the institution, but rather moves across and outside the institution. The second is that there are already templates and lessons in place across the Black diaspora and in other departments like Indigenous studies, gender studies, ethnic studies, that have modeled the possibilities and limitations of establishing a program like Black studies, what I call like an identity interdiscipline, in a university context. So for me, this is where Black studies at Queen's began. It's always anchored to and in excess of the university itself. The field of Black studies and what we get from the field itself provided the model for this kind of dreaming. As we know, Black studies was formalized and institutionalized soon after the civil rights and anti-colonial movements in North America, Africa, the UK, the Caribbean, and in the 1960s and 70s. And from about the late 1960s and to about the 1980s, many universities in the United States successfully fought for programs and departments in Black studies, Africana studies, African diaspora studies, and so on. In Canada and the UK, we are only now seeing new programs that focus on Black diasporic cultures. Globally, mostly, but not only through the discipline of anthropology, many universities in North America, Europe, and elsewhere have housed African studies departments since about the late 1960s. So these are like just very generalized observations that I've made about how Black studies pops and where it pops geographically. Of course, we can argue that Black studies began well before that time, because the field is always punctuated by teaching, scholarship, and activism that took place within the context of slavery and its aftermath. If we pay attention to historical narratives, we can track how learning and teaching are central modes of Black survival, resistance, and rebellion. And we can look at canonical slave narratives like the work of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, Mary Prince, and many others to notice that the practice of studying and sharing ideas about the intricacies of slavery and racial violence is important to understanding liberation. We see this kind of Black studies detailed in C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins as well. the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, another canonical thinker. For me, especially his brilliant text, The Souls of Black Folk, which was written in 1903, is a go-to for Black studies, as well as different moments like the Great Migration, the Negritude moment, the Harlem Renaissance, the rise of hip hop, anti-apartheid struggles. These kinds of moments and important rebellions allow us to engage with willful Black knowledge making. And that is the intent is not just to center Black lives, but to learn from Black worlds. And I think that this pedagogical angle, whether it's in the university or not, is very important to dreaming and imagining and building Black studies. This can be paired with Black studies practices that are less distinct and might hover beneath our radar because they are not splashy as afros or raised fists. And these less splashy Black studies practices include labor struggles, feminist activism, anti-prison struggles, and so on. So together, all these kinds of moments and struggles are what Robin D.G. Kelley calls freedom dreams, Black creative, intellectual, and activist movements that imagine new worlds by challenging and changing the existing definitions of freedom. For Kelley, then, the Black imagination, the dream, materializes freedom. So Black studies itself is an interdisciplinary field. It encompasses politics, education, literature, music, geography, history, criminology, gender studies, surveillance studies, anti-colonial studies, studies of health, environmental studies, and more. The field also drifts into the hard sciences, engineering, and math. While many Black scholars are trained in a specific discipline, their work often transcends disciplinary rules. So a Black studies sociologist might use music and musicology and studies of ecology to theorize racial profiling. Or a Black musicologist might use fiction, math, and poetry to examine how time is attended to in hip hop lyrics. Black feminist Patricia Hill Collins is trained in sociology, and her text, Black Feminist Thought, draws on fiction, statistics, the law, music, geography, media, and more. At the same time, in the US and now the UK, one can receive a PhD in Black studies, or Africana studies or Black diaspora studies. And these departments, they not only signal a moment of meaningful institutionalization where Black studies is absorbed into the neoliberal institution, they also simultaneously offer interdisciplinary degrees that center histories, experiences, and struggles of global Black communities. So for me, Black studies is always interdisciplinary and always shifting. Black studies is not a clear-cut discipline with a clear-cut set of books or ideas or solutions. It's the practice of knowledge making. What we've tried to keep in mind at Queen's is the flexibility and relationality of Black studies, while also recognizing that the field itself has provided an extensive archive of what our work means and how we might move forward. Black studies moves unevenly across histories. It's not always linear. It works across many knowledge sources and disciplines. It emerges from multiple geographies, and it draws on the global struggle against white supremacy. So what I've started to think about is how Black studies is an activity. It's not, I would say it's a place because I like geography, but I think it's an activity that shifts. And as I've mentioned a few times, it's not always linear, it's relational. It's about what we do, not necessarily who we are. In 2011, Queen's held an event with Black alumni, faculty, staff, and students. The event was initiated by Stephanie Simpson, who oversees the Human Rights Office at Queen's University and is currently the Associate Vice Principal. While this 2011 event kind of defines when and how Black Studies began at Queen's, the work of colleagues Edward Thompson and Kristen Mariah, as well as student activism, draw attention to a longstanding commitment to anti-racism by the Black community at Queen's. And so they look at the kind of longer, deeper history of Black scholars at Queen's. In any case, at the 2011 event, participants were invited to share their dreams for Black Studies at Queen's. The community emphasized more hires in Black Studies, more hires of Black identified faculty, a minor in Black Studies, a major in Black Studies, an endowed chair in Black Studies, scholarships for undergraduate and graduate students, and more. What was illuminated as well was not simply including more Blackness at the university, but providing structures that will sustain an already existing Black community. It's important, I think, to begin from this point that Blackness isn't new at Canadian universities. It might be unseen, but it's not new. So how do we think about the absented presence of Black faculty, staff, and students, and move away from this idea that this community is new at Queen's or elsewhere? I think this allows us to think about what is already here. So whether this be at York University, at Western University, at Queen's University, at Dalhousie University, at what's it called? Toronto Metropolitan University, the TMU. We have to think about what's already here and build on that, which is a real abolitionist kind of vibe. This isn't just thinking about how many Black people are on campus, although that matters, but also about how Black scholarship and activism animates our collective worlds. In this way, representation is paired with a capacious understanding of liberation. Black people are provided with a context that is not novel, but is instead far-reaching and relational. And I think it's worth repeating here, like just to rewind to what I said earlier on, that Black Studies at Queen's did not come from the request for Black representation. We were not out there saying we want more Black people. Instead, we were saying, what are these Black books and this Black community telling us about what Black Studies means? And then how do we sort of revise and build according to that framework? It's a very nuanced difference. It's not about populating, it's about building. This means that universities must commit to hiring Black faculty and staff and recruiting Black students, of course, but they must simultaneously emphasize that these folks are not just bodies or diversity check marks. This entails advancing and centering Black experiences and Black studies as pedagogical insights. What the 2011 event at Queen's offers is then both a critique of a colonial institution and an opening to rethink what social change looks like for Black folks who have been so regularly viewed as bodies and check marks. The 2011 event is entangled, most of us probably know, with a series of reports that named racism at Queen's. So at Queen's, we have the Dare report, the Henry report, the Picardy report, as well as the TRC. When it comes to race, Queen's is not known for anti-racism. Queen's is known for blackface parties, men's rights groups, for students pushing Black faculty and staff off of sidewalks, for anti-Indigenous and anti-Black violence, for swastikas spray painted on the walls, for sheets that read, "No means yes." So the reports that came out, the Dare report, the Henry report, and so on, what they did was they documented discrimination and racial violence. However, I would argue that the Picardy report, which is the most recent report, it was the first to really recommend changes, and some of these recommended changes overlapped with the dreams that were shared at that 2011 event that I just spoke about. When I began at Queen's, I think there were about 5 or 6 Black faculty and one or two Black staff members. And I'll be frank and share that I've been recruited by 2 US institutions and 1 Canadian institution. And each time Queen's retained me. During the second retention, I requested that we develop a minor in Black Studies. I was given the okay like that, but I was not offered any support for this work. They just said, that's wonderful, do it. And so with the help of Sammy King, we began the paperwork. We also met with advancement to discuss an endowed chair in Black Studies, and that went nowhere. And we can talk about why that went nowhere. While this was happening, we developed the Queen's Black Faculty and Staff Caucus. So what I'm trying to get at with these sort of smaller stories or these other stories is that the development of Black studies at Queen's can be thought about through a lot of different moving parts, that we're always and all invested in anti-racism, and the pressure of anti-racism pushed up against and reconfigured the institution itself. After the Picardy recommendations were announced, we saw some new hires, the hiring of Kristen Mariah, Grace Oganyakan, Yolande Buka, Elijah Bisung, and others. But it's important to signal that Black and non-Black faculty on the ground pushed for these hires, and that after these hires, faculty on the ground provided mentorship where the university did not and would not. So a report isn't a direct line to new hires and flourishing. There's a lot of invisible work that makes this happen. And the aftermath is haunted by the question, okay, so we have more Black scholars, how do we retain them? How do we ensure they are not overburdened with diversity work? How do we center their sense of place so they are able to do their best work when we know that they cannot move toward promotion with the ease that white scholars do? Again, we're thinking beyond representation and check marks or bodies. We're thinking about how we bring the politics of Black studies into the university so that we can sustain this world. I did the bulk of the paperwork for Black Studies program on my own, the first draft, and then with Danita Arthurs, who is now the office manager in gender studies. But I hired her as a casual worker. I don't know what the word is, contract worker. I paid for large chunks of Danita's time out of my own pocket, or out of my research grants, and the Faculty of Arts only pitched in once we were rolling. They never reimbursed me for that money. And they've heard versions of this talk and me say this, and they still haven't reimbursed me for the money. The Queen's Black Faculty and Staff Caucus, while we were doing the paperwork, they were updated on where we were. Beverly Mullings and Sammy King reviewed the documents alongside the various administrative pockets like teaching and learning and research that help you prepare the application for provincial review. And we started to build a few partnerships with athletics, with Agnes Etherington Art Gallery, with the Black engineering students, and with departments that may not see themselves as Black studies or that think they have nothing to do with Black studies. Math, for example, offered amazing support, which we were surprised about, by suggesting that Black studies could be integrated into their department through studies of racial bias and critiques of predictive policing. So the minor in Black studies also emphasizes global Black studies. And again, this is and what we wanted to do and what we kind of had to do was build on existing courses that attend to Black studies, either what we did was we clustered them: existing courses that attend to Black studies, existing courses that attend to Black studies and Indigenous studies simultaneously, and then existing courses that attend to studies of racism, colonialism, and resistance. There was no cluster hire in sight for us when we came up with these ideas. But the courses were surprisingly there, in particular because we were interested in always pairing Black studies with Indigenous studies. So just as a side note, you can't get a minor in Black studies without taking at least, I think, 3 courses in Indigenous studies. So because the university is always trying to pry us apart and say Black people are different from Indigenous people. And so we intentionally entangled Black and Indigenous studies as we were building Black studies. But there were other courses that were already there. In fact, there were over 100 courses. There were enough faculty, Black and non-Black, to support the project. In the summer of 2020, we collectively witnessed another iteration, as we all know, of Black Lives Matter. I don't need to explain why that rebellion took place, only that it resulted in a whole lot of institutions thinking about Black people. And they were thinking about Black people through the lens of recuperation. And it was really scary and kind of, I don't know, it was terrifyingly thrilling. There was a scramble to repair anti-Black racism by scrambling to fill the halls with Black people and scrambling for more representation. At Queen's, I think the first version of the scramble was 1 or 2 lines dedicated to Black studies that units across the university, so across faculty, arts and science, health, the School of Kinesiology and Health, engineering, everything. We all had to compete for 2 lines. And so we all had to put in an application and say, we need a Black scholar because. And so if you have a history of Black studies, any kind of history in Black studies, thinking about a bunch of white faculty fighting over a Black body is incredibly disturbing. Let me just put it that way. Eventually 7 lines were established, and 2 of those lines were dedicated to Black studies. So they were 100% Black studies, and 1 search failed. Black faculty were tasked to sit on all of the hiring committees. So I was on 4 appointments, 4 of the 7, I think 5, 4 of the 7, maybe 5 of the 7 appointments committees, for example. The Faculty of Arts and Science stepped up to offer support by promising that all new faculty service would be dedicated to Black studies rather than in their home department. So our hire in Black religions is housed in religion, all of her services in Black studies. She can decide if she wants to do service in religious studies, but she does not have to. Everything is building toward Black studies. They offered modest funding for a speaker series and a course release for the program director of Black studies. It's worth mentioning that we're still grappling with the same questions that I began the conversation with. How do we retain these Black scholars? How do we ensure that they're not overburdened with diversity work? How do we center their sense of place so they're able to do their best work when we know they cannot move toward promotion with the ease that white scholars do? How do we imagine Black studies beyond representation or check marks or bodies? So one lesson for me was that Black studies, as I mentioned, must be envisioned as an activity. The program itself must be a series of living documents that support Black and non-Black scholars who are interested in doing decolonial work. If we get stuck scrambling for Blackness at the level of representation, we reify that Fanonian despair by placing Black faculty, staff, and students as objects among objects. If we think of Black studies as creative labor, full of interdisciplinary possibility, we can shift from the kind of crude diversity allocations and toward a different kind of project. Or the university is not perfect. The university will never, ever save us. So how do we reinvent what the university means for Black faculty, staff, and students? So I'm going to end by talking a little bit about where we are and where we might go. I think for me, we are still in the very early stages of developing the minor in Black studies. Samara, I think, took the first BLCK course, which was online, not this September, but the September before. But we didn't start accepting students until this past spring. We have 5 students. We predicted 3, so I'm very excited. And they're all women, feminists. I suspect, but who knows? I'm okay with them not being feminist, of course. I've been working with Daniel McNeil. So he was hired as one of the 100% hires. He's the Queen's National Scholar Chair in Black Studies, and Taylor Sinak, who was hired as the program administrator administrator for Black Studies. I think this is another side point that Black Studies needs administrative support that are cognizant of the field itself. So they don't need to do all the readings that faculty and students do, but hiring Taylor Sinak, who has an MA in gender studies and wrote an MA thesis on Audre Lorde and Audre Lorde's poetics and queer belonging has been a dream come true, because you don't have to explain everything to her. She knows what the story is. She knows what Black Lives Matter is, you know, these kind of very basic things that some administrative support may not know or do not want to know. So both Daniel and Taylor are creative thinkers and great interlocutors, and we're in a good place. Some of our existing projects have included teaming up with the design company from South Africa, and they created our visual identity for the program. And we also hired an intern from Queen's to help with that project. We developed, Daniel, I will say, developed and produces a podcast series that's really wonderful. We have a reading group, which all Black alumni are welcome to join us whenever you want. We are building playlists. We also have Teaching While Black workshops to help particularly junior faculty build course outlines but also, how do you teach at Queen's, right? How do you walk into a class of 80 undergraduate students and your class is called Introduction to Black Studies and there's only 3 Black people in the class, right? How do you deal with that? Jennifer Leith, who I didn't mention her by name, but who was our Black Religions hire. She developed the first iteration of our speaker series called Black Queer Religions. And we're still trying to iron out the relationship between Black Studies and the Queen's Black Faculty and Staff Caucus, but also we're still in the process of building connections with other student groups and this alumni group in particular, we want to build. And so we need to think about, how do we build a node? And Yinka knows about this from our work on the Scarborough Charter. How do we build this place at Queen's that can be a node or a center of a bunch of constellations that support Black students, Black alumni, Black staff, Black faculty, Black junior faculty, postdocs, and so on and so forth. We've had other great hires: Joseph Kamenga, who works in globalization and Black studies; Julian Okapitek, who's the beautiful poet who works in Black creative writing; Vanessa Thompson, the brilliant Vanessa Thompson, and Kesha Favre. Kesha was hired in geography and planning. Vanessa is the other 100% hire in Black studies. So we've really, and I think that this is the other thing, like, it really, I'm going off script here. I'm looking at the time. We have 20 minutes left, so I'll wrap it up soon. But being present on those hiring committees was extremely important, I think. I mean, hiring someone like Vanessa Thompson, who is an abolitionist, who has connections with colleagues in South Africa and all over Europe, and is doing this kind of activist work, is a game changer. And so there is the work. I was exhausted after all those hires and being on those committees, but it was worth being exhausted. So, and then these new folks joined an already committed group of Black scholars and Black studies scholars. So the other thing is that we're doing a lot on very little steam. I think that's another thing. I just mentioned that I was exhausted. I feel exhausted. We launched Black Studies on October 21st. It was a great time. Lillian Allen was in the house. It was beautiful. But we definitely are tired. I think the other thing that doesn't go noticed or doesn't go remarked on is that the moment that we appeared on Twitter, there was racist trolling, right? So the moment that, I think it was Faculty of Arts and Science, I don't know if it wasn't advancement, but was like come and join, like become a pre-doc at Queen's. And we got all sorts of racist trolling and the kind of the toll that takes on you. So the celebration of Black studies is always tethered to these other moments of white supremacy and hate mail that I've gotten, right? And things like that. So there's all these other kind of difficult moments that's paired with celebrating the wonderful intellectual work that Black folks do. So just to sum up, what I've learned is that Black studies at Queen's and elsewhere is an enactment of liberation in multifarious forms, that liberation emerges from Black worlds, but is not committed to what Paul Gilroy calls the dismal dance of ethnic absolutism. That is, Black studies is not just about collecting Black bodies, it's about all our Black and non-Black futures. The other thing I've learned is that Black studies should always emerge from Black and anti-colonial scholarship and activism, not diversity plans. The other is that Black studies is already here. We should build on existing structures and infrastructures inside and outside the university setting. And then finally, Black studies is an activity, as I just mentioned. I think that racism is cagey and racism is flexible. And so Black studies has to be flexible and has to shift and has to be revised. If racism shifts according to time and place, and so we have to constantly sort of reconfigure who we are as a way to push against white supremacy and racism. And this means living with unpredictability. This means kind of like building up something and feeling secure in it, but then noticing that it has to shift because time demands that we shift. And so the lesson, this is the final lesson, and this is from scholars like Paul Gilroy, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is that Black studies is ongoing and it's never resolved. So that's my talk for you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Dr. McKittrick. This is especially exciting for me personally, and it's hard to find the words to sort of think about what this might mean. I mean, as a as a 2019 Queen's grad, I think the first time I was assigned an academic piece written by a Black author was in my final semester of my 5th year. And it was a very short bell hooks piece, which was actually the same singular piece that was assigned to me throughout my time at law school at Ottawa, which is a different story, but
Wow.
you know, it's
which one? Do you remember which one it is? Which piece?
Yeah, it was I think it was it was talking it was about the patriarchy.
Okay.
The context being we had watched the Stepford Wives.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And we were discussing her work in connection to what feminism looks like from the white woman perspective, and how it changes from other eyes. And that's how it was used in both contexts. I don't particularly remember. Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, I know that we're a bit off script here, but I know that she circulates for a reason, and she's such an important and like kick-ass figure who we've unfortunately lost. But I am interested in what circulates. Like what it is. Like, why is it not her critique of Madonna, for example, or there are certain ways that she gets read. So that's why, I wanted to know, like, I can't believe that happened to you twice. Like, there's like no variation here.
Yeah, that was absolutely, and those were the only 2 times that I was exposed by design, in my academic career. So I just wanted to start with a couple questions for you. I have a bunch, but in the interest of time, I will keep it light. We do have until 7:30 though.
Oh, right. Okay, good.
Yes, so we're doing okay for time. In a couple other times you've spoken, you've called the Black Studies program a multi-scalar expression of Black liberation. Can you tell us what you mean by that, and sort of how the program transcends the confounds of the classroom?
Sure. Yeah. I think for me, I think this happens in two ways. The first is to understand, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, that the university is porous. So I think one of the things that I ask, like when we think about Black people at university and when we accept that Black people are intellectuals, something happens, and this has happened already at Queen's, where we get kind of closed off and we're just kind of celebrating people at the level of representation, and it scales us down. It scales us and it assumes that we're just the scale of the body or the scale of the community sometimes. So I think that we have to think bigger, and we have to think about the different scales of Blackness. And I always imagine this through the concept of diaspora, and that Black people are scattered. So how do we think about the local in relation to the community, in relation to the town, in relation to the province, in relation to the country, like how do we think about what Black people are doing elsewhere? And I think that's especially, and this is the kind of the second point, but I think that's especially important in North America, or quote unquote overdeveloped nations, where we assume that we kind of hive the continent of Africa off of Black studies. We assume that the continent of Africa isn't part of Black studies, or that there's not such a thing as global Black studies. So if we think across scales, and if we think of Black studies as multi-scalar, then we can't disappear the continent of Africa. It doesn't become invisible. It becomes part of the conversation. And that's been really like very, very important to me. I think the other, this also speaks to the privilege of not the privilege, but the centering of US Blackness in how we understand Black studies, but also how we understand Black oppression in Canada. We're coming out of it, but we can still find documents where they will, we still do this, I think maybe somewhat so in the hires that we see, particularly at some Ivies like McGill, where they'll hire a Black US scholar because they know more about race than a Black Canadian scholar, right? So there's this kind of thing I think that happens too. So how do we, and I'm not saying that US Blackness is wrong, or that we shouldn't hire US Black scholars, but I think that we should be cognizant of how Blackness is portrayed across, or how Black people experience things differentially across scales, as a way to displace that US and or North American building up of this the colonization they have of they colonize what Blackness means. We allow that to happen too. So it's how it's read. But I think that those are some of the ways I try to think across scales and across geographies, so that we're not kind of recentering the same story over and over again. And we're noticing that Black people aren't just bodies, because that's what diversity sort of is invested in. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. I think one thing that I've noticed in particular is that there is quite a difference in the experience of even, say, our U.S. counterparts to some of us that experience Blackness in Canada, and oftentimes it is equated in ways that you've got to work particularly hard to explain, through, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of work to sort of dispel those kinds of things. And it's an added layer that is perhaps unnecessary, but it adds a little bit extra to doing the work. And so as far as like a Queen's experience, as I think as many of us on this call have experienced, there seems to be, or sometimes seems to be, a lack of space in the Queen's community to speak about the Black experience in a meaningful way. And so what I wanted to ask you, is this a barrier that you've had to face in connection with the Black Studies program? And if so, how have you gone about creating or taking up that space in ways that have felt appropriate for you?
Yeah, this is a hard question, because I think that the moment we take up space, we create exclusions. So I think that, so I'm gonna rewind, and one of the things that I think that's even important for me, building Black Studies at Queen's, is that my community wasn't always at Queen's. I live in Toronto. I commute to Queen's. My family is here. My colleagues and co-conspirators are outside of Kingston and in Kingston a little bit more now. So I think it's important. I mean, I said the university won't save you, and I don't think Queen's will save us by giving us a lounge to meet in, although we should have a lounge to meet in with vinyl records and all sorts of things. But I think that I do think it's important that we build community outside, within and outside the university. So that's one way to kind of undo those barriers, or sort of challenge the university's assumption that we don't need community, that we just need a room, or we just need a safe space. There's never a safe space for Black people. I don't care where we are. I mean, we might be in our, maybe we have places in our home, but they're not typical safe spaces. Where we produce safe spaces might be moment to moment. They might not be ongoing and concrete and always the same place. We may have to escape another place and create another new place. So we're mobile people, and we're migratory, and we always build liberation on the move. And so that's, I think, important. That was always important to me when building Black Studies at Queen's, but also surviving as a professor at Queen's. The first 10 years I started in 2004. The first 10 years, it was probably less, probably the first 6 years, I didn't talk to anybody. I did not talk to anybody. I would go back home and I would cry. I hated that place, but I also didn't want to talk to people like these white feminists, who are like kind of, they're really laying a lot of work on you. It was my students, Darcel Bullen, Aruna Boudram, there's a number of others, but in those first, Grace Oganyakin, who's now a professor at Queen's, but who really, I was like, oh, this is who I have to build this for. Like, this is the space that we need, but it has to be flexible. Like, it can't just be, it's going to be a place to land,
right,
for Black people to land.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing. Much appreciated. Yeah, I know during my time, there was a lot going on. I did have the privilege of playing sport, and belonging to a large group. I think one of the things that really brought me towards advocacy on the Queen's campus in the Black space was that a lot of people weren't having as much fun as I was. Many of the people that I had met, say outside of the sport community, left very, very quickly, and had no comfortable space to exist. And where I was having a good time, maybe it was only when I got to class, and I was like, this is a strange place to be.
Yeah.
There were a lot of individuals who didn't share that experience at all. And so, that sort of led me into, wanting to have an interest in what the experience might look like for everybody else moving forward. And, that said, I think as somebody who has since left, something that I'd like to know is, how can alumni get involved, and what kinds of contributions are people like myself able to make to the Black Studies program, and how can we lend a helping hand?
Anything you want to do, we are there. I think there's so there's a few things. I mean, one of the things that we would love to do, it's a sort of multi-prong. I mentioned earlier that we want to try and create some kind of network that connects Black past, present, future folks at Queen's. So part of that work, will come out, hopefully, out of the Scarborough Charter. So it would really just be being there if we reach out to you, and sharing your stories with us. The other things that we've been thinking about specifically with alumni is doing spotlights on alumni. We do not have a graduate of the Black Studies program yet, but we really want to spotlight Black scholars who've been here, and what they do. What are you doing now? Okay, so you're doing a degree in law, what kind of law is this? So these spotlights would either be through a mini talk or a workshop or whatever, or even just something that we could, showcase, I guess is the word that we would use, on our website about all the great stuff that Black scholars do. I think one of the things I've noticed, I'm the grad chair right now as well, grad chair of gender studies, and I've noticed that we often lean toward spotlighting students who have gone on to do academic work, and we don't spotlight enough students who do activist work, who run small businesses, who, you know what I mean, who's sort of a diversified economy of what they do. So any kind of highlights that you guys could provide about what you do would be amazing for us. The other things that we're thinking about is, we would love any Black alumni to join our reading groups whenever they want. So that's also about keeping our communications open, and things like that. And I don't know how you folks feel about mentorships, but mentoring, like you mentioned, advocacy for students, Dantel, and I think that would be great if we could set up some kind of, and I think for me, it's over the next 3 years, how do we create a mentorship program? It's not tomorrow. We have to be patient, so we do it right. So working with us on setting up a mentorship program that wouldn't be too onerous for you would be great too. So you meet a student twice a year only, right? It's not like a weekly thing where you have to check in, but a couple times a year, just checking in with students would be really lovely too. So those are some of the things we're thinking about, any of those would be great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's great that you say that. I mean, some of our initiatives, thus far in the past year or so, align very well with what you just said. We've had a lot of conversations about who we would like to have speaking and who we'd like to highlight, and a big topic of conversation that Yink and I discussed many times was that we would like to highlight individuals that are doing a lot of things, and it's not just academia, not just your business students, not just your typical exciting academic highlights, but people who are doing arts, people who are creating, people who are as you said, doing activist work and doing a lot of things with within their communities that are equally as important. And so, if we can connect on that point moving forward, that would be great as well. The mentorship program that we've been building and working towards, I think would be a wonderful thing to connect with the Black Studies program, because we have a number of individuals who have a lot of things to share and would like to mentor students, perhaps not on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, but twice a year. And
couple times a year, just checking in, and it like, I think that's really important. That would have been important for me as an undergrad.
Absolutely. And I think, we'd like to bridge that gap if we can. And this would be an excellent opportunity to do so. And just sort of on that point, you did touch on this, but are there perhaps any other opportunities for the QBAC alumni community to have more direct involvement with the students at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think once it would be great if folks if they considered coming in as guest speakers to some of our core courses. I mentioned already, I mean, having Black alumni come in and saying, this is what I did and this is how I did it, how did you get there, would be incredible. And I also want to, Dantel, I want to ask you, can you come in and help us think about athletics? We don't know what to do with athletics. Danita is familiar with the director of athletics now, our department manager in gender studies, but we really want to support Black athletes. We haven't been able to get that partnership off the ground. So I'm like, yes, come and talk to us about your experiences and what it was like in athletics and why, what's going on there and how we might think about have conversations with each other about how we can support Black athletes. That would be so meaningful.
Absolutely. Not to put anybody on the spot here, but we do have Mr. Benjamin Arhan, who is our director of virtual events. He is a little bit closer to athletics than I am currently. I think, we've had a number of good conversations about, what it means to be a Black athlete at Queen's, and leveraging opportunities and what kinds of supports are necessary. I think it would be great, if the both of us could have the opportunity to come in and speak. And I know there are a couple more Black athletes now than there were when I was around, and Ben has been coaching and mentoring them. And so he's got a pretty close eye on what that looks like, and I think he'd be an excellent resource in that regard. So that's another way that we can sort of get involved and get together, and I think it would be a great starting point.
I'd love that. Yeah, I've had a few students who are athletes, one who's now my MA student, and a Black student years ago who was on the volleyball team. And I just love, they just sort of wandered into my courses, I feel like. And I'm like, they need to take Intro to Black Studies, and think it would just be they just add so much to the conversation and create a nuance that isn't normal, that isn't always there in classrooms. So it would be great. Yeah.
No, absolutely. What I am going to do is I'm going to open it up to our other participants and attendees to ask any questions if they have any. Feel free to type in the chat, or you may raise your hand and let us know, and I will make it possible for you to speak. So I think we have one here. So
Okay, so I'm not used to webinars. I just wanted to say the chat is disabled. So to let you know that. But also I just wanted to say how I can't see Dr. McKittrick anymore, but I'm so jealous and I'm so excited for what's to come. I hope I can get involved. I know having you as my professor twice was a huge treat. And I think you were in my third year, the first time I had a Black professor at Queen's. And I think, oh no, now, are you still the only Black professor I've had? Maybe.
Are you in law school now, Zoe?
I am, yeah. I'm at Lincoln Alexander, which has been great. So I'm in my second year, but I'm like, shockingly, I think we have like 2 Black professors here, but neither has taught me. But anyway, I can join as a panelist. Now you can see me. So I just wanted to say, one, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. And again, I'm so excited, and I wish that the university would be more supportive in some ways than they have been, but as usual, we push through. We have to. But yeah, I just want to say I'm very jealous, and I hope I can like come peep in on a course or something on one of these days, because it was truly a great experience to have you as a professor, and I'm sure all these other professors are doing amazing things too. So that's all.
Thank you, Zoe. You know, you were one of my favorite students, as you probably know. I don't know if you know that. But yeah, and I think that the core, like those, you know, that hip hop course is
good.
Is now like a core course in Black studies. So I think that, and that course was successful. And I remember when it was the first time I taught it when you were in it. And I remember at the very last class thinking that course really bombed. Like it was a nightmare. Yeah, in my head. And then I got the feedback and I was like, these students loved this. They loved it. I was like, oh my God. Oh my God. Do you remember there was no technology in that room?
Yeah.
It was such a trash room. And I was like, oh my God.
But small too, I remember.
Yeah, but now it's like, it's a capstone course. So, and that's because you made it successful. So
it was, it's the course that I think I talk about the most, like, of courses I took at Queen's. Like, this was one of the coolest courses I've ever done. And I just love how you were talking about the interdisciplinary nature. And it's like things will come from all different topics. And I think it's a beautiful marriage of studies. And that's exciting.
It's good.
Miss it in some ways, but Yinka has her hand up, so I will mute, but thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Dr. Catherine. So it's funny because Zoe, you pretty much introduced my question. So my question for you, Dr. Catherine, is from an alumni perspective, we've heard this a lot, like, and, you know, talking to folks like, you know, Kiana, Zoe, I was even talking to Kat earlier today, and she mentioned all this amazing course in the Black Studies program. So for alumni such as I that graduated about a decade ago and we're interested in maybe taking one of these courses, or so are there plans for this course to be maybe like on demand? Will it be open to alumni? And not just alumni, but what about folks outside of the Queen's University or Queen's community that are interested in course? Are there plans to maybe create some sort of light version that, or even maybe hybrid version that folks outside of the Queen's community can partake, so that we can, because I'm so piqued when you were talking to Zoe about the hip hop course. I'm like, this is a hip hop course, you know? So that's essentially my question, is that are there avenues for alumni who are far out to take some of these courses? Are there on-demand courses, or are there plans in the pipeline for courses to be accessible for everybody? Thank you.
Thanks, Yinka. I think we've touched on this before through the Scarborough Charter, and I think that I would love to do some version of the massive online course that University of Alberta does for Introduction to Indigenous Studies. I don't know if I want to do that actually myself, like be that person, but I would love for Queen's to offer some kind of online version of the Introduction to Black Studies. The one glitch, there's a couple of glitches. One is launching it. You could, if you launch it as hybrid or as an online course, that's one thing. Doing a massive online course is another thing. But the Queen's resists actively, not like I'm going to turn that around. Queen's insists actively on in-person, face-to-face experiences for Queen's students. They love Queen's students. They love them to be on campus, and so on and so forth. There are online versions of a number of courses, but there's also a complication there, which is your online materials then become the ownership of the university. So there is, like, you have to go through these other kinds of hoops to own your own course. So it's tricky. It's trickier than just kind of like, I could go onto my OnQ for Black Studies 200 and you could take that course. I'm not there. It was developed during COVID. So it's just me and my iPhone talking to you, right? So I think there are ways, like the course in itself is done and could be offered. But I think it's very important. I think it's important, if we do believe that the university is porous, then this has to be an option. And I've been thinking about this since you brought it up in one of our conversations about the Scarborough Charter. So it's on my mind. It's just a matter of how to administer it. Yeah, I really want to do the Beyonce course, and I think that should be online. Actually, I want to do the Rihanna course. I'll be truthful, but I do think we need to do a Black popular culture course as well that gets into that longer history of like blackface, of what it means for a Black person to be on stage, you know, all these other things, and have that opened up, and that's how you enter into Black studies, and it has to be porous. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much. So I'm going to turn off my video because Samara has a question. Samara, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much for that talk. It was great to listen to that conversation. I really liked how you mentioned that there's considerations that have to be made when you're teaching Black studies in a place like Queen's, especially with issues around diversity and things like that. So I'm kind of wondering, you sort of mentioned this, but what advice do you have for students and faculty when they walk into a Black studies class and there's only 3 Black people in it?
Get ready. I think the important thing would be to find colleagues, Black or non-Black, that are on the same page with you politically. I think that's the most important thing that you can do, and build community with them. And I think, you know, for faculty, it is about mentorship. So, you know, one of the reasons I'm exhausted is because I'm mentoring most of the new Black women faculty hires. But I'm happy, as I said, I'm happy to be exhausted doing this, but also recognizing that I can learn from them too. So the mentorship is a kind of a co-mentorship, and it's a conversation about how we navigate the classroom. So for faculty, that's definitely what I try to foster. For students, yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's hard sitting in a classroom with 3 other Black people and 60 white people and talking about lynching, you know, or any kind of racial violence, talking about George Floyd. It's hard. And so I think that's why it's important to have community, but also have community outside the classroom. Like, it's okay to go outside that classroom and hate what happened, and like go and tell your sister or your mother or whatever. So as I said, the university won't save you, but you can build little places, but also recognize that you have to talk to people outside that classroom about your experiences. Yeah, but it's not easy. It's not easy. It's hard. So that's part of the other thing too, is like, it sucks. It's really, really, really hard. But if you're committed to liberation, you'll find like other ways to think about that and to kind of reconfigure that as a moment of struggle towards something, you know? And I think that's always what's kept me going, is that it's hard, but it's a struggle toward a better future, you know?
Thank you. I appreciate that very honest answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. McKittrick. Can you see the questions in the Q&A?
Yes, I can.
Box there? There's one addressed to you, so I would just like to give you a chance to read it.
My question to you today is how to learn about Oh, okay. Yeah, so thank you, Sophia, for the question. The question, I don't know if everybody can read this, but to learn more about the partnership you've made with Indigenous studies, e.g., are they also taking a few courses within Black studies? So at this time, I mean, Indigenous studies at Queen's is a mess. It's a hot mess. So let's just face that and then move forward. So I think that's important to acknowledge. Indigenous studies was built before Black studies, and it emerged out of literatures, languages, and cultures. And the focus of Indigenous studies at Queen's was primarily around teaching Mohawk. And that's how their minor began. So it begins with a very specific and very unique and original plan, which is how do we both teach and preserve Indigenous languages in Canada and at Queen's specifically. For that reason, it's not super intersectional. Like they didn't come in as an interdisciplinary program. They came in as a language. This has created a few problems for Indigenous studies and Black studies, and which means that to grow outward and to sort of support Indigenous students who don't take that language stream has been really difficult, because you need to have the language as part of your degree, if that makes sense. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that, you know, I was hired at Queen's to teach Indigenous studies. That seems unusual, but that's what I was hired to do. Bonita Lawrence was the Indigenous scholar. She left, went to York. I was hired to do as a contractually limited 3-year appointment. And I remember in my interview commenting on how impressed I was with all the courses on Indigenous studies. And they basically said, can you teach them? And I said, of course, I can teach them. I don't want these courses to go off the books. So my relationship with Indigenous studies comes as, you know, I always read Indigenous studies, but it came as a surprise because I was tasked to teach 3 courses in a field that I wasn't super familiar with. That said, so there's that relationship where I also learned that Black studies and Indigenous studies always have to be interconnected and entangled. So that's part of it. So when we built Black studies, we modeled it after the Indigenous studies application. So they sat side by side. And so even though they began and sustain a language stream, they folded in so many courses into that Indigenous studies major and minor and then major, minor, medial. We used that as a model. Some of those courses are Black studies courses that are included, but not as many as we have of Indigenous studies. So you can do an Indigenous studies without necessarily doing Black studies, but you can't do Black studies without doing Indigenous studies. I hope that answers your question, Sophia.
I will give her a chance to reply if she'd like, but we do have another hand up in the chat. It is Celine. She should be.
Celine, go ahead. You can start talking.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that I'm at such a weird angle. Like, I have to like prop up my phone. Hi, Catherine. It's so good to see you. And thank you to the folks who organized this. As an alum, like this is really great, a great space to be in. I have a question in regards to a point you had made about building community inside and outside of the university, and you spoke about like the sacredity of space, safe spaces, moment to moment, and building liberation on the move. And I found that really compelling, and I've been sitting with that since you said it. But I also take that in alongside what you said about taking up space could potentially to exclusions. So I was wondering if you can speak to that, because in thinking of safe spaces as moment to moment, particularly for Black identified folks, I think about like if you're in a meeting, I say meeting because I work in administration now in the university, and I think about being in meetings with other like Black identified folks, and they may say something like in vernacular, and I'm like, okay, I see you, you know what I mean? And how like that really creates a sense of belonging, or walking in the hallway and your eyes meet with a student and they give you that affirming look, like I see you and you see me and we see each other, like this is good type of thing. So I think about that, but I'm thinking about like sometimes the necessity and feeling that we need physical space, but also thinking about how unrooted Blackness is, and thinking about like the diaspora, having a lot of thoughts. But I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that, this speaks to your research questions a lot, Celine. So I think that you know, like in some ways, like how we have to create space moment to moment. Like Black people have always done that. So whether it be through marronage or fugitivity or errantry, like there's lots of ways that Black people have thought about the moment to moment production of space that's always unrooted. So I think that it is diasporic. I do think that you can also build a concrete space, but I think that Black people know that won't last forever. I think that we're one community where we're like, there's going to be some kind of swastika on this, you know what I mean? Or whatever it is. So I think that there's a knowledge there that's based on the stories that we tell each other, that liberation is, as I said, kind of mobile. And it does move from place to place. In terms of taking up space, I'm always wary of it, because I think that there's a wonderful moment in a film where June Jordan talks about the Black Power movement and how it was striving for equity and how wonderful it was. And then all of a sudden the Black men wanted the Black women to start walking behind them. And she's like, this is not my freedom, right? But it's this moment of like total insurgency of the civil rights movement, of the claim to Black humanity. Black feminism is like on point, right? It's on point. These women are making breakfasts for kids that are starving. Like there's just so much going on. And then there's that quick moment where they're like, you walk behind us. So patriarchy sort of rears its head. So I think that so then Black feminists reconfigure the Black Power movement to accommodate them differently. And so you see, so I think that that's what it is. It's about revision. Because the production of space on colonial terms always puts up, we will always fall into that trap. We will always fall into that trap if we produce space on colonial terms. We will always say there's no trans people invited, right? Or we will always say no whites allowed. Or we will always say, you can only be queer and you have to prove it. So I think that those are I think important. That's important, and it's important that those are colonial geographies, and that we get seduced into thinking that a safe space is that we have to establish a safe space on colonial terms. We don't. We can establish safe space on anti-colonial terms. We do not have to own space or who comes into our space. We can think differently about the production of space. So that's one thing. The other thing is, or that's a number of things too, but that's what those nods in the hallway mean. Right? That's what the Black nod means at Queen's for me. It's about that. It's about liberation on the move, and it's about acknowledging and humanizing each other on the move. You don't need to, you can have a tea with that person if you want, but they maybe don't even want to care about, like they want to have tea with you. They just want to know that you exist, and that's fine. You know, so yeah. And that's what your thesis was about. For me.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate your insights always.
Okay.
Okay. Do we have any, we've got maybe about 6 minutes left. Do we have any last questions that anybody would like to ask? You may raise your hand if you wish. I mean, I have a few questions that I'd like to ask, so.
Okay, that's fine.
Oh, Yinka, did you have anything?
No, I was just coming in just to see if there's any questions. Okay,
for sure. No, I think we're good for questions. I am happy for us to sort of wrap it up with some closing remarks and get on with it that way, unless anybody has any qualms. But
sounds good.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Dr. McKittrick, for taking the time and for all of your insights and giving us a little bit more into what Black studies might look like at Queen's now and in the future. I am definitely very excited about being able to watch this sort of come together and grow as time goes on, and hopefully it's something that I can be a part of, and I think that everybody here would also appreciate an opportunity to be a part of this in some way, shape, or form. So that's very, very exciting. And again, I also would like to thank everybody who joined us for making this a safe space to come in and chat about something that is obviously very, very important to us all. And I will pass it off to you, Yinka, if you have any closing remarks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dental. Again, I'm just going to add a little bit more. I think Dental pretty much had everything. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Katherine, for joining us. This was enlightening. I mean, I've heard you speak a couple of times, but each time there's always always something new that I take away every single time. Thank you for sharing specifically on how alumni can get involved. You mentioned mentorship program, you mentioned alumni spotlight, specifically spotlighting alumni who are doing advocacy work, activism, entrepreneurship, passion projects. You also mentioned guest lecture and speaker opportunities, and just in general, how alumni can get involved. So thank you so much for sharing that. And also thank you so much for sharing the story of how the Black Studies program came to be. Thank you for sharing all the hurdles that you had to overcome. And also one key thing that you also mentioned is that, research, partnerships, how all the faculty and everybody came together. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And also just shifting focus a little bit. Also, I would also like to thank our Office of Advancement. So thank you so much, Ben Seawold, for helping us put this together, setting up all the logistics so that we can have the events. And thank you, Samara. Thank you so much, Samara. Thank you for sharing this with the student groups, sharing this with the student groups so that they're made aware. And finally, I want to thank our audience. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. We know you could be watching Netflix or even the soccer, the FIFA World Cup, but you're spending the time with us. So we really appreciate you for doing that. So thank you all so much. Again, if you're not on our newsletter, we really urge you to join our newsletter, follow us on social media at QBA Chapter. And our goal again is to have these speaker series on a quarterly basis. So again, this is our last event of the year. So we're glad we're able to have Dr. Katherine join us. But overall, thank you all so much for joining us. And we wish you all a wonderful week, but also happy holidays. We didn't get a chance to connect. Happy holidays, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yinka, for the invitation.
You're very much welcome. So bye, everyone. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Chantal. Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.